You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Gabrielle Esperdy, welcome to Places at the Overhead Wire on Mondays. We have a Monday show, Mondays at the Overhead Wire, and we were talking with Places about, kind of maybe some collaborations, and so we thought this one might be a good way to kind of include some of their work and have a good discussion. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and always love having these kinds of conversations with folks.
Yeah, well, I'm super excited to have you on because, Places basically said, here's a bunch of articles, maybe these would be of interest. And I saw yours and I was like, okay, that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about autocentricity, as it were. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, your research, your interests, et cetera.
I am an architectural and urban historian, and my day job is teaching in the Hilliard College of Architecture and Design at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, which is in Newark, which is still New Jersey's largest city for a little bit longer. I've been there for about 20 years, and I grew up in Philadelphia and then moved to New York. So New Jersey was always the in-between place. And so it's been fascinating to be there, seeing the metropolitan landscape of Newark and the entire state. And that's become actually something that I'm very, very interested in terms of this idea of, let's call it horizontal density rather than vertical density. And so that difference between the central city and all of its skyscrapers and buildings that are very close together, and the kinds of density that the automobile brought about. And so most of my work deals with what I like to now call metropolitan landscapes in order to avoid I don't know if it's a binary or a dichotomy between urban and suburban, because metropolitan kind of captures all of it. And one never knows, where does urban end and suburban begin? It's not usually at a kind of municipal line. So most of my work is situated in that broad landscape. And I'm really interested in the kinds of connections between what we think of as the conventional city and then the linear city as it stretches out, which of course wasn't caused by the car, but the car completely transformed the landscape because of that. And most of my work, I call myself an architectural and urban historian because for me, buildings are the beginning of bigger and deeper investigations about the history of the built environment. So which includes buildings and highways, infrastructure, which we can talk a lot about in the bill that just passed, which was actually why there's an article about Newark Penn Station coming out, because the governor of New Jersey snagged some infrastructure money to be able to actually do some long delayed renovations of that station and so on and so forth. So I study architecture, but not capital A architecture. I study, some people call it the commercial vernacular. It's all those everyday buildings, the kind of in-between buildings that are actually as I like to say, the backdrop for our everyday lives.
I'm curious, you use the term horizontal density. Do you not use the term sprawl or kind of exurban areas? Or, obviously they're part of the metropolitan area and if they're connected through an economic lens, but is that kind of similar or different?
Part of it is a potential reason for choosing one term over another. I do think that sprawl has become such a loaded term, whether we call it urban sprawl or suburban sprawl. And even though scholars have made arguments about the nature of sprawl, I use it when it is, let's say, historically appropriate. But it's one of those words that shuts conversations down because it's hard for students or folks living out there in the sprawl to see anything of positive value even though it's the way they live. And so horizontal density to me is a way at explaining the kind of urbanism that became far more commonplace in the middle and then kind of second half of the 21st century into today. And even though we see places, if we think globally, sure, Dubai is a dense, centralized place, and we think of it as instant urbanism, but at the same time, Dubai was building that instant urbanism with all those extremely tall towers. They've also been building out this way. So it really is, I think it's part of our 21st century condition. And I find that by describing it as horizontal density, it does two things. One, you understand its direction. And then two, unlike sprawl, most people don't think of that in terms of density. And I think one of the things that's important in the 21st century when we're talking about questions of sustainability is for us to understand what we mean when we're talking about density. And that density does not always mean a centralized downtown or central business district with super tall towers, et cetera. Most people in New Jersey do not believe they live in a dense place, even though it is the densest state in the union. And people talk about greenfield build out by like 2030. And yet, again, perception, right? They think that they live in this place that is not urban, that is not even urbanized, but it is. So there's a kind of polemical reason for talking about horizontal density rather than sprawl.
I appreciate that. And also, I mean, it leads into this discussion of the oil crisis and your piece, Twilight of Autopia. One of the things that caught me is your discussion of the architecture, your discussion of the gas stations and the time period in which they were, in some of those photos anyways, the time period in which they were built and the time period they were actually serving. It was really kind of an interesting contrast in there.
Yeah, gas stations are I think they're a fascinating building type. They are one of those kinds of buildings that are so ubiquitous that most people, even a lot of people who are interested in architecture, just tend to ignore, right? They sort of fade into the background. They've never really occupied, well, people think they've never occupied a central place in, say, the history of design, which is in fact not true at all. You know, some of the earliest gas stations were like designed by architects and right on through most of the 20th century. But it is interesting to me, the way in which, a building gets built. And if it's something like a theater or a museum or a courthouse, we understand it's built for longevity, right? It's like, we believe it's going to be there and that its age is part of its value and significance. But in the commercial landscape, the values are kind of reversed, right? So gas stations generally, at a gas station or a shopping strip or what have you, those things they're not built for the ages. They're built to respond to the market. And when the market changes, because markets are fickle and consumers are fickle, there's a notion that the building is somehow going to change as well. But what frequently happened because of sort of larger economic realities, because many service stations were franchised and maybe or chains, and there wasn't a clear program for modernization and update. What happened is that you get a building built in one period that would just have this very long life without necessarily it being rebranded or rejuvenated. And one of the photographs that I came upon when I was doing the research for American Autopia, which is what the Twilight of Autopia was derived from, was this, what I find very poignant, this photograph, an AP photograph that was taken during the oil crisis of the 1970s. And you see this contrast between this kind of building that's from the 30s, that at the time it was built was just like, boom, modern, come fill your car up here. And what? Well, the gas is no different than any place else, but maybe you got service with a smile. But then by the 70s, because it's never been really rebranded, it just starts looking like this little aging rinky-dink building, and which to me was very poignant. And again, I mean, bringing almost a kind of intentionally nostalgic view to a consideration of a photograph like that. And again, you're writing a scholarly monograph, but at the same time, you're also making an argument. And so nostalgia becomes an important part of I would argue, of how people started to think about the car-centric landscapes of the middle of the 20th century, that already by the 70s, it seemed like a different moment, that the 50s were back then.
It's so interesting to think about those timelines. There's been a thing going around on Twitter that's kind of a make yourself feel old kind of commentary where somebody says, well, Joe Biden is closer to Lincoln's presidency than he is his own when he was born, and those types of things, like just kind of those time capsule ideas. And I was thinking about that as it pertained to kind of that nostalgia that was happening in the 70s over that 50s. car culture. And that was that's only 20 years or so. And here we are in 2020 and looking back at like 2000, that seems pretty far away, even though it's not really. And so that 20-year time frame, I feel like time frames lately, because of the pandemic and other things, they're getting squished because of social media, et cetera. The news cycles are faster and faster and faster, whereas 20 years, it seems like a lifetime, but 20 years back then, it doesn't maybe seem as long. I don't know if you can talk to like the spacing of time, as it were.
Yeah, that's so interesting, the kind of the collapsing of time and the way that that's tied to generational change. I think technology plays a huge part of it. I mean, I forget, what's the theorem about the speed of a microchip, which double.
I think is it Moore's law?
Moore's law, right.
Yeah.
I sort of feel like, we could apply that culturally as well, and in some sense with the kind of the speeding up of everything. But it is interesting if we look back historically and think about the way in which these periodizations took place. I think in a century that had such profound markers as World War I and World War II, so that the interwar, again, we refer to them as decades, but it's like, okay, it's kind of 20-ish, it's 20 something years. That, I wonder to what extent that became such a cultural touchstone that those 20-year increments seem to make sense in the middle of the 20th century and moving forward. Because if you think about, at least within the culture of the United States, as we move from after World War II, then to Korea, and then slid into Vietnam, and because those conflicts, wars, never had the same defiant end, because it was, the United States slinking off in disgrace, et cetera, I think that there was perhaps a slipperiness about how we define things, because it's like, we talk about the Vietnam era, but when did that really end? Was it the fall of Saigon? It's like, there are just so many ways to figure that out. And I also think that by the 70s, given the way that what we now refer to as the 60s, youth culture, the civil rights movement, the kind of supposed fear of the so-called silent majority that we now realize was just like code for scared white people. Mm-hmm. I think that maybe the nostalgia that begins to happen in the 70s is also a nostalgia for, a kind of power and hegemony that's slipping away. And so it fuels that, remember just that little bit ago, things were different. And that's why I think, again, the kind of talking about nostalgia with, say, American Graffiti, a movie that, comes out in like 72, 73, whatever it is, but it was set only a decade earlier, right? A decade earlier. And a 10-year lens is enough for it to seem like a different world, because 1962, right? Before Kennedy is shot, before Malcolm X is shot, it's like, it does, there was that belief that it was somehow a more innocent time. And of course, again, like, that's a belief that only middle-class white people had, because for everyone else, it was like, yeah, no, it was pretty sucky before, and it continues to be sucky. But I do think that that the necessity of those kinds of cultural touchstones, right? And of course, film, I don't want to say is complicit, but, film is important in this way, right? Because American Graffiti made people nostalgic for that period as well. And even though it was just Lucas's attempt to just kind of, create this sentimental picture, if you will, of his young adulthood, that then became everybody else's nostalgia. So I do think we can never discount the power of moving images in particular to create our own sets of memories. And so I think for a lot of people today who were, where were you in 62? I think for people who were young adults in 62, no doubt a movie like that plays a part in how they actually remember that period.
That timeline is interesting too, the 20-year that you mentioned, and specifically with George Lucas, because I'm such a big Star Wars fan. Like, I really am just immersed in the topic. But it's interesting to think about Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi as being in the early 80s, the new movies being in the late 90s. That's a 20-year kind of time period in itself. And you have this kind of culture war between these two groups of people who believe that the original trilogy is it. And some, the kids that grew up with episodes 1, 2, and 3 think that that's it too. So throughout time, it's not just Star Wars, but everything. It seems like he's been on this 20-year clip of every 20 years in, the 60s going to the 80s. That's a 20-year clip in itself, making this kind of connection to people's nostalgia generally and their youth And I think that that might have been kind of what kept car culture going ultimately. It's at least it seems so in your thing. And it's interesting, from the movies, the episodes 1, 2, and 3, there's a whole planet that's a city. It operates in a different way than the car culture did. And, I think that was very specific. But it also kind of goes to that 20-year time frame that I think is just super fascinating, and especially at that inflection point of the oil crisis. And I'm getting to this point where we've had a couple of guests on recently that are Dutch or in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, the oil crisis was taken in a completely different direction. Their move towards bicycling, towards, sustainability started because of the oil crisis. Our continuation, our inertia of autocentricity continued at the oil crisis. And we end up in these two completely different places, which I find completely fascinating. And I don't know if you've seen that the way that different parts of the world took the oil crisis in different directions and where we are now with, kind of this autocentricity and how that nostalgia kind of played into that as well.
Yeah. Wow. There's so many things to unpack there. Let's stick with Star Wars first.
Sure.
Well, the 20-year thing, I mean, obviously that's also generational, right? So there's research done about that. And anecdotally, when Lucas was interviewed around the time that American Graffiti was being finished and it became such a phenomenon, there in the New York Times, I think it was in the Times, there was this interview with him. And what I like to describe as the understatement of the galaxy, the last line in the article was something like, and director Lucas says that his next project is kind of a Western set in outer space. I was like, okay, is that the first reference to Star Wars in print?
Maybe. I mean, yeah. I mean, it was also based on him driving around with his dog, Malamute, right?
Yeah, so. Absolutely. I too am a devotee of Star Wars. And in fact, just got out when my parents sold the house and then moved into this place, I had a whole bunch of boxes and stuff. And one of the things I found was my collection of Star Wars cards from 1999. Nice. And so I said to my wife, I think I'm going to get these framed. And there was just like a grunt and we moved on to something else. But, in terms of different responses, the Dutch, well, first of all, the Dutch are the Dutch. I think they were, I don't know, I'd like to think they were grappling with the realities of post-colonialism. And I think the Dutch shell is somehow
Royal Dutch Petroleum.
Yeah, bound up in that. Also, it's a super small place, right? And not that this gives the United States a pass, but I think one of the tensions has always been the great dispersal, right? Like this is a big place, first of all. And because it is a big place, we tended to want to connect it. And so when the decision was made to build out an infrastructure that was predicated on the automobile, and then the largest public works project in the history of humankind, the interstates, so many billions of dollars were fed into that. And deliberately, the oil companies refused to ever let, and even this goes even back earlier, no, you're not going to put a train line on the George Washington Bridge. No, you're not going to build larger right-of-ways so that we could build in any other kind of infrastructure. And those discussions were already going on in the 20s and the 30s. When Benton Mackay, who went on to develop the Appalachian Trail, he was really interested in, hey, we're at this moment of building highways. Wouldn't it be kind of cool if all these highways also had a kind of pedestrian right-of-way as well? So I feel like we had all these opportunities where, despite the scale of the continent, we could have chosen a different path and we didn't. And I think part of it has to do with the power of the oil companies, the power of the big three automakers. And, Americans we are complacent by nature. I mean, I really do feel like we are complacent and disengaged by nature. And, that the fat cats just sat around getting fatter, and that aspirational, everybody wants a part of that. The idea that an automobile became a status symbol, so problematic. And so I think our inability to step back, despite really, people really thought in the 70s that it was going to be this moment of rethinking this car dependence. And instead, that didn't happen. And to the point I said, maybe before you hit record, that Nancy's always trying to get me to write this kind of last chapter. When I started this project 10 years ago, I thought that Autopia was over. right? I thought that, the return to the city and pedestrianization and all this. And of course, I was wrong. And it took a while to realize that. And probably also I was just kind of urbanistically navel gazing, right? If you live in Manhattan, you tend to think that like every place else is like that, or that it's not, but that becomes just part of your way of navigating the world.
Mm-hmm.
So surely everyone will understand that this is a better way to live than having to get in your car to do everything. But despite those inflection points, we never quite pivot off into a different direction. And even now, and I know this is the article that there could be, is that the autonomous vehicles and electric cars are still cars. And we might, like with electric vehicles, maybe we'll be able to solve some part of our environmental and energy crisis, but it still doesn't solve an urban crisis, because even if everything was electric, we still have this condition of necessarily driving so many places. So the Dutch, smaller country, easier to rethink those things. And also, unlike the United States, the Dutch had these other crises of land issues, living with water. There are all kinds of reasons that they had to kind of rethink their proposition. And the other, people sometimes bring up the example of China and bicycling in China. And of course, the moment the economy broke big towards controlled free market and there was suddenly building everywhere and highway building everywhere, sure, people still ride bicycles, but have they bought into the car culture? Absolutely. And again, now we're left, whether we want to refer to ourselves as the developed world or whatever term we think is useful, we're left saying, please don't make our mistakes, all you places that are industrializing and modernizing now. And rightly so, their position is like, fuck you. You screwed everything up. And now we're not supposed to exploit and extract.
Do what we say, not as we do, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you mentioned, James Flink and even Lewis Mumford had these discussions about motordom and autos and how they were going to be the death of cities. And it happened for a little while there in the 80s and 90s. And it's interesting to see this hope pop up again, that we could get away from the inertia of automobiles. And that's not to say that, and I feel like I have to do this caveat every time, that that's not to say that there's not a place for cars and there's not a place for vehicles because of the way that we've built our built environment. But in cities, I feel like they're kind of overrepresented as a means of transportation, as such that if you're in a Manhattan, if you're in a San Francisco, which is where I am right now, there's better ways to get around and more efficient. And we only have so much space. But that discussion was happening, in the 60s and the 70s and even through the 80s. And this hope kind of pops up every once in a while, and then it gets punched down, and it seems frustrating that keeps happening.
It does, but I do wonder, well, there are two issues to touch upon. One is in the car in conventional urban places, like conventional meaning dense cities. And then the role that the car has. And then the other issue is the car in those other places, in the urban periphery, in suburban, in sprawl landscapes, if you want to describe it that way. And what is so interesting to me is you're absolutely right that this like free the city from the car, it keeps popping up. We're in another one of those moments now. But what I find fascinating is that now, and let's say now meaning the past 10 or 15 years, maybe even 20 years, because certainly in New York, we can point to the Bloomberg era. We've revisited a bunch of things that failed in the 60s. And so if you think about pedestrianization was this way that in the 60s and kind of into the 70s, we're going to claw back the city from the car and we're going to pedestrianize. And so we are going to close off streets. We're going to make cities for people, et cetera, et cetera. And it comes out of Jane Jacobs and Lewis Mumford to a degree, but though by then he had sort of moved on to kind of regional thinking, et cetera. And so many of those pedestrianization schemes in the 60s failed, and they failed miserably. And so pedestrianization got blamed. It's not that there was anything wrong with the idea of pedestrianization, but you need people if you are going to pedestrianize. And so the idea of introducing these schemes at precisely a moment when middle-class white people are leaving cities was absurd. And suddenly now, for the past 2 decades, so many places have in fact enacted street calming schemes in which they increase the size of traffic islands to such an extent that they can become actually a place where you can have a little cafe, that they have pedestrianized certain streets or turn them into bus corridors, et cetera. And lo and behold, what do we find? That at a moment when people are in cities, that suddenly those pedestrianization schemes work. And so I think if I was ever going to be hopeful, maybe this is the moment to be hopeful, because in so many places, the pandemic forced this kind of conversation. In New York, de Blasio administration had safe streets programs where they would close streets in the summer and it sort of turns into a block party, et cetera. And that would happen maybe every Sunday for a couple of hours. And then during the pandemic, and I'm sure that San Francisco enacted similar kinds of things, that suddenly we had the possibility of being in the street all the time. And so with a little shed set up for restaurants, et cetera. And now I think there's a healthy debate going on about, well, how much are we going to give back to the car? Maybe we're actually going to figure out a way to not exactly go back to pre-pandemic. But that's happening in central cities. I don't see that yet happening in places outside of central cities. And that's, in some ways, the cities will eventually figure it out. I'm concerned more because despite the population density of all of our major cities, that's not the attitude in so many other places. And especially in places that might technically be cities, but don't see themselves as cities. How do you take that same idea of pedestrianization in a place without sidewalks, in a place that's all about surface parking? It's much harder to do it there and to claw back the territory of the car. Aggressive bicycle lanes, that's one way, but that's not going to change everything.
There's also an interesting pendulum swing towards the discussion about whether not just to repurpose streets away from cars, but whether to actually, where we should be giving that space to commercial interests. So like, restaurants or people like that, should it be commercial space where business can be done, or is it a space for everybody? Is it a space for all of the residents of a city? And so that's an interesting discussion that's going on at the same time. And so even in cities, you have a kind of a push and pull on this idea of opening space for people in streets. And I find it really fascinating. I'm always curious of what the end result might be.
I think a lot of that is also connected to the fact that a century of the automobile has corrupted our notion of public space in cities or anywhere. I have a PhD student now who is writing about the future of automobility. And that's a whole specific kind of part geography, part transportation studies term, automobility. And one of the things that she has, well, not so much discovered, but been able to put her finger on is this notion that if you go back, and we've all seen pictures of cities in, say, 1920, or some moment before the cars became dominant, before there was a safety infrastructure of automobiles, where everybody's in the street, right? There are horses, there are kids, it's chaos, but the street belongs to everyone. And so when we thought about our space in the city, it wasn't just about the building and the sidewalk, it was actually also about the street. And then the car came along and changed all of that. And we've forgotten, like we have no cultural memory of when the street was ours as citizens. And I think that's really important. And obviously it's not just it wasn't just the car. We can think about all kinds of municipal reform efforts to get the peddler carts, as LaGuardia used to call them, to get the peddler carts off the streets and all of that. So there's always been this tension between kind of regulation, control, hygiene, and our natural tendency to want to use things the way we want to use them. But it's also interesting to note that when the car, and now it's almost comical, when cars first arrived in cities, one of the advances that they believed was going to happen is that the cities were going to be cleaner. Because of course, horses, they left horse shit everywhere, and they would die in the street, and then they would just sit there until
they would just leave them there. Yeah.
Leave them there. And so there was this whole, if you kind of going through municipal journals from the 1920s and such, like cars, yay, they're going to fix everything. And of course, it's also important to note that at that time, electric cars were already a real thing. And if electric cars had been allowed, if you will. I mean, if we want to dabble in conspiracy theories and such about like killing the electric car. But if electric cars had been allowed to develop in the same way, imagine if all of our cities were only electric cars. I mean, they'd be very different. You drive on the Cross Bronx Expressway at the moment when it kind of is under you leave the George Washington Bridge and it becomes this like cavern with the bus station on top of it and the apartments and everything. And it really is like, on the one hand, it's fascinating. On the other hand, it's one of the rings of hell. And it is so filthy, right? Because all of that exhaust has no place to go. And sometimes when you're stuck in traffic there, it is really fascinating to just to see it. It's like this Pyrenean space, but it's the filth that's so astonishing. And sometimes I think, wow, what if they had all been electric cars? At least it wouldn't be filthy. I'd still be stuck in traffic, but at least it would be different.
That's interesting. Do you think it would be different? I mean, one of the questions we have is if oil consumption in the 70s and the impacts of the oil crisis, for an example, are we going to consume electricity the same way? Are we going to act as the same kind of consumers with electricity? The bets seem to be that we are, and people are really worried about this. I mean, some of the environmental groups, we have to reduce VMT 30% in addition to electric cars to actually get to our goals because of the amount of emissions that we're putting out. But I'm wondering if that consumerism continues, even if it's electric, if it's oil, does it matter? And if it's electric, maybe we don't even have the arguments about the same type. I mean, we'll have particulate matter arguments, obviously, the rubber tires and the brake dust and all that stuff, but maybe we won't have the other arguments of the car creates so many, CO2 emissions. We have all these days in Los Angeles and Cleveland and other places that lead to Clean Air Acts and all that stuff. I'm curious if that continues. Do you think that continues? I mean, even now we're talking about electric vehicles. Is the consumption issue still an issue?
I'm sure that it is, because I think we also, at least I'm sure maybe some people have played out these future scenarios, but if our entire fleet of vehicles, and I forget what the number is of how many cars there are in the country now, but even if that entire fleet of vehicles was electric, it wouldn't solve our environmental crisis, right? Because there's that much more electricity that has to be produced. And we haven't converted all of our production of that electricity to clean electricity. So I was thinking at the kind of micro scale of the city that potentially, and also thinking, what if, right? And in the 20s and 30s, really in the 20s, the electric vehicle is promoted as it's going to be your little runabout, like your station car. And again, obviously this was talking about a very middle class audience, white and middle class, but yeah, the thing that you ran around to collect groceries in and stuff, that would be electric. And then you'd have your gas powered vehicle for long haul. If you were driving to Maine for the summer, whatever it was that those middle class people did in the teens and 20s. I don't know. I do think that, again, I am gravely concerned that we've just swapped one kind of car for another kind of car, and that there are these larger issues. Despite the fact that the Tesla has become a status symbol, it is not going to solve our problems, and it is not going to solve our urban and suburban problems. And there is a fair amount of magical thinking surrounding that. And again, I think it's that once again, the car is going to solve our problems. And that to me is why that's where the nostalgia comes in. Because at each moment, there's always been, oh yeah, we did that wrong, but now we're going to get it right. And we don't.
As many transportation folks often say, lately it's a geometry problem. They're still taking up 350 square feet each. It's still that type of problem. And you're mentioning runabouts. I mean, I think that's kind of how people are selling, electric scooters and electric bikes these days. It's kind of like, hey, this is your way to get, last mile connection, or a way to kind of pop out of the house and get something if you need it and bring it back. It's interesting that, again, it comes full circle. And another thing I thought about while you were chatting was kind of the nostalgia thing. We don't have an American Graffiti for that time when people were in the streets, right? There's no nostalgia for that time because there weren't a lot of movies made that focused on that. There's no after American Graffiti, that post-high school graduation night kind of thing kind of took off, and every generation has its version. But there isn't really one about kind of hanging out in the streets that I can think of anyways. There might be, but I just don't know it.
Certainly none that reached that level. I mean, there were, what's the one with a very young Humphrey Bogart, The Dead End Kids, but that's not widely known, and probably not on Netflix. And so it never had the opportunity to penetrate into our cultural consciousness. There's a quote, and I can't remember which book it's in, but Le Corbusier talks about remembering, and it's not at L'Étoile, at the Place de la Concorde in Paris. And he's remembering what it was like when he was a very young man and there were no cars. And it's a description that's filled with nostalgia. And obviously the Place de la Concorde is one of those vast, vast spaces. And thinking about how you could just cross it without worrying about kind of taking your life into your hands, because already by the 20s, it had become the place of the automobile. And so in a way, it's almost as if Corbusier remembered that, and he starts imagining a different urban scenario, looking back at that moment. So that guy had some memory of that. And then, of course, what happened is that his ideas got mishmashed and translated incorrectly, because actually he sort of had a good idea that, right, the traffic will be there and we'll all be up here. We shouldn't be crossing with the cars. But very few of those schemes were ever realized in the way that he imagined them.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it seems like he was that times Elon Musk, if I must, with that comparison. But, the thing about Elon building these tunnels, it was all because he couldn't get through traffic fast enough for himself. It's a personal thing. It's not necessarily about helping society. So he comes up with the Boring Company, which has all of the other issues in its own. But, it seems like, there's a flicker of a truth in there, but the wrong answer comes out when they try to solve it.
Yes. I think that's definitely the case, because we all know that actually collaboration is when we get the best results. And any kind of megalomaniacal vision is, I think, perhaps always going to be doomed to fail, or because it doesn't want to deal with the larger consequences. And in, the whole Musk's tunnel thing, there were projects. There was a guy who in the teens, I guess, had this idea of taking the railroad infrastructure, some of which is underground, and using that to build out a linear city. And that we would all, and it's this wacky scheme, but it was for this kind of linear urbanism, sometimes underground. And it sounds almost like science fiction, but he's like, well, we have all this infrastructure. And of course, we forget sometimes that by the 20s and the 30s, railroads were already on the decline. And so there was all of this unused trackage, much of which became the basis for some of the earliest, certainly some of the earliest high-speed routes, like the Pennsylvania Turnpike, et cetera. So I don't know, it'd be interesting to think about if we're at a moment, and this doesn't really answer the kind of energy questions, but maybe we are at a moment when we can take our auto infrastructure and retrofit it. That seems to me to be something that has possibility. And I'd love to drill into the details of the infrastructure bill and to see to what extent, say, the rebuilding of this, that, or the other finally has in it some provision for transit or pedestrians, et cetera. When we go to Maine in the summer, when we get onto the Maine Turnpike, there's a sign that says no animals ridden, driven, or led. And I kind of love that the idea that like they had to put a sign on the highway saying that you could not drive animals down the highway. It's like, well, is that just a sign that's been there forever? Like it suggests such a completely wacko use that you would drive your animals down the Maine Turnpike. But I also kind of love that. It's like, what would that look like if you, and of course, highways outside of major areas, I guess there were farm to market roads where they were farm to market roads. So you could perhaps drive animals on them.
They're on the Chisholm Trail. They're going to Fort Worth to the slaughter yards.
Exactly.
Something along those lines. They're oxen or something. I don't know. There's a psychological impact of the oil crisis too that I felt. It feels like some parallels to what we're experiencing during the pandemic. Did you kind of feel during the pandemic that there's almost flashbacks to that time period in terms of how there's a fear of running out of things? It's almost the connection even to some of the supply chain issues I feel like we're having right now too. Do you feel like there's a connection between, or at least a mental connection between those two time periods that we're seeing at the moment?
I think for me, the connection, I almost want to say it was the opposite, sort of seeing places where, well, certainly seeing cities without so much traffic. But then the flip side of that is, and not so much traffic because there just weren't a lot of people. But then the flip side is everybody driving more. So I'm not, I don't know that I really thought about it or experienced it in terms of certainly a nostalgia for the before times, but that was always about the gathering of people, et cetera, and the kind of social congregation. It's true though, that fear of running out of, say, toilet paper and whatever else could be seen as related to one's fear of, but we never run out of gas. Again, I think that's the other thing that we don't, since the oil crisis, we talk a lot about the price of gas, but we never talk about there's no fear of running out. And I think that's the other part of our problem, is that we don't think about it in the same extent. Like we think about it like electricity. The electricity is always there until it's not. Mm-hmm. And when it's not, we just go like this, waiting for it to turn back on. I guess the gas is comparable.
Well, that feels like that another, instance of an inflection point. I mean, we were talking about the Dutch earlier. There was a piece about Vienna as well recently. I think it was in the Washington Post, talking about how they built themselves a 10,000 year floodplain to kind of keep from, and even this summer when they had the massive floods in Germany, they didn't have a problem because they had designed this thing, because they'd have previous floods. But those floods in both the Netherlands and in Austria, those, were specific points in time when people felt acute pain. And so they felt like they needed to do something about it. But as you're saying, we had a little bit of a toilet paper shortage. There was a little bit of a supply kind of chain issue at the moment. People are complaining about gas prices that were the norm in 2008, 2009. We don't really have that specific pain point that is going to spur us to actually make change, it feels like, as the Dutch did, as the Viennese did, as other folks have that have made these changes, it feels like.
That's interesting too, because as one of the things that occurred to me is that whenever we've had severe flooding, look at, say, New Orleans, the response is always, and this has to do with a kind of, do we live in a technocratic society that, well, we can just fix it. Not that we have to learn to live with nature, mm-hmm. but that we have to control nature. And the Dutch, by contrast, have long said, well, no, we have to live with nature. So how do we live with water? And we've never done that, right? Our response is always harden, harden, harden. We'll just keep building the barriers higher and higher and higher and higher. And again, maybe it's a kind of blind faith in technology, in engineering, because for so long, it seemed like we were putting our faith in the right place. And it's really interesting too, in terms of all of these shortages. And I remember I was reading somewhere, it was someone crazy, like, what's her name? One half of the Ab Fab duo. I'm blanking on her name, the British actor. She had this idea that the only way we're really going to solve the climate crisis is if we go back to what were like wartime restrictions. And we sort of say, okay, these are the climate restrictions. And I thought, oh, that's such an interesting idea, because people used to be this notion of we are patriotic, we are supporting the war effort. And maybe now people simply wouldn't, I don't know. But it is interesting. Since World War II, other than the energy crisis, have we been asked to do something for the public good? And willingly agreed. People won't even get the damn vaccines.
Yeah, that was in my head. I was like, man, all people have to do is get vaccinated. And
yeah.
It seems cyclical. It says 20-year timeframes. I think there's probably a psychology book or something, 20-year timeframes out there.
There probably is. And I think too, how long are people going to continue to use the pandemic as the excuse to say, keep driving? We certainly see that in New York and New Jersey. I feel like I'm always proselytizing. I finally convinced this student who's a little bit older coming back to school. I kept saying, why are you driving? Well, because the train's so expensive. And I said, if you actually sat down and calculated whether or not the train is in fact more expensive than all of your gas and your tolls and the wear on your car and the wasted time of you sitting behind the wheel. And 2 weeks later, I see him come into class and he sort of has a pep in his step. And I said, Josh, you seem happy. He's like, I finally started commuting by train. And I did the math. And then it turned out that he got a student pass. And he's like, I can't believe I was so stupid. But he's like, I'm a Jersey boy. I was just like, you always drive, even though New Jersey has an astonishing rail infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And people complain about the trains being late. Yeah, the trains are sometimes late. But you know what? You're stuck in traffic. You're always late. One, we have to believe in the project of driving less. And then two, we do have to be proselytizers. And I, as someone who teaches at what is still largely a commuter school, I make it my mission to proselytize. And, we had just today, we had a really interesting discussion. I'm the faculty advisor for our AIA student group, and they run this program, the National runs this program called Freedom by Design. And it's a student run design build project. And this year, the project was to build a parklet. So taking a parking space and turning it into a short-term park, this for maybe 3 months, and then they'll take it down and then put it up. And our university didn't want to give them a parking space. And the head of facility, we had a meeting with the head of facilities, and he says, "Oh, we have a parking crisis, and we need every parking space, and you should see all the illegal parking." And I said, "Seriously, you think giving these kids one parking space for 3 months is going to have any impact on the parking shortage that you claim to have, instead of encouraging people to take the train?" And he's like, "And because of the pandemic, no one feels safe on mass transit." And I was like, "Oh, you just gave away the story. The fact that you actually refer to it as mass transit and all the kind of coded language that's involved with a term like that." So I do think it's like everything, there need to be these incentives, or the incentives exist and nobody pays attention to them. I mean, we have tax incentives. If you're an employee of the state of New Jersey, you can buy all of your transportation, your train tickets, your metro cards, you can buy them tax-free. You pre-tax, take that money out of your salary if you're an employee of the state of New Jersey. You can't use it for parking, or maybe you can use it for parking, and that's part of the problem.
Cash out or something.
Yeah. So it's just, there has to be it's almost like a re-education that has to happen.
Well, my geography professor in college always said, hit them in the pocketbook. That's the only way people will pay attention, is if you hit them in the pocketbook. And so if you give those incentives, and you have to make it comfortable too. I have friends that are, sometimes they'll lament that they don't take transit. And then I look at where they live and where they're going to, and I'm like, well, you weren't given a good option, to be honest. It's not there. And I'm not going to yell at you for, making the best choice in terms of time. If it takes you 2 hours to get there instead of 30 minutes, what do you waste an hour and a half for? But at the same time, there's a lot of trips that could be made by an active transportation mean. I'm trying to get away from alternative, because it's not alternative, it's active.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's another important point, is that the way we talk about things matter. People still refer to the automobile as private transportation, as if the infrastructure is at all private. It's the most public thing. We have all invested in it. And yet somehow people still think that driving a car is a private thing, and that they don't have no interest in public transportation. That's a branding issue, right? That that needs to be completely flipped, so that people understand that the roads they drive on are public transportation. And again, I think clearly this goes back to middle of the 20th century. And I think all of this language was used intentionally, private versus public, mass. It was all of these things at a moment when cities were being demonized as places of chaos, unrest, or you have to live with people who have a different color skin, all of those things. That language, I mean, I'm sure those people, well, we all know urban used to, this dog whistle, urban culture, urban transportation. And then we all thought maybe that changed. And then, of course, when Trump got in office, because he was of the generation who really thought that he was completely vested in that kind of polemic, and to demonize the idea of centers, inner cities. And then I thought, where is exactly the inner city of New York? That's always been the question I ask. Is it where the most expensive of, like, where Beyonce and Jay-Z live, in the most expensive zip code in the city? Is that the inner city, or is it someplace else?
In the country, in the city? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We had Linda Samuels on recently, and she talked about, the time change from the word public works to infrastructure, and, moving that aside. And I'm always interested in the framing of things and the way that people talk about it. I always think of George Lakoff's Don't Think of an Elephant as kind of a primary text for that. But it's interesting to think about those language changes and how those affect kind of how we see even, motordom and autocentricity and all those things as well. I mean, how we've gotten to this point. I've just been thinking about your conversation about nostalgia too. I mean, people look back on certain terms and certain ideas and words, and they'll internalize them, and then they'll keep them forever maybe.
Yeah, and I think part of it too with the discourse of the car is the language is important, but also the distancing. There's a kind of distancing that happens in which it's almost as if blame the car because autonomous vehicles did not yet exist. It's not the cars who created this, it's the people who created the situation that we have. And I think that there has been such a success at somehow avoiding complicity in the state of affairs. And whether you think the state of affairs is bad traffic or the devastation of the environment or climate change, there's been a way of, by blaming it on the cars rather than like us making conscious decisions that led us to this. But I also think it's that people don't think about their own. We know this with consumers, right? They'll complain about the fact that the corner store doesn't exist anymore, but then you found out that they just bought everything from Amazon. And so I do think we live in a kind of disconnect, so that language and discourse is a big, big part of it, but that there's also our own role in buying into the kind of message that we're sold. And again, I'm not one of those people who thinks that consumers are completely manipulated, because I think that we can make choices. And I think that we do have the power to sway markets, if you will. But I also think that there's a lot of the folks who wrote Middletown, sociologists, who thought about that we live in a gorged stream of new things to buy. And that like we're just so surrounded by opportunities to consume that we almost begin to do it passively rather than actively. And I think that we swallowed the language in the same way.
So last question, after writing this piece and after thinking about it a bit, what do you take away the most from the oil crisis of 1973 in that time period? And what do you see as our way forward from 2021 on?
When I think about the oil crisis and learning, obviously one knew about the oil crisis, but as I was doing research for my Autopia project, learning the way in which the immediate impact of it was felt so culturally that people did, it wasn't just, damn, gas is more expensive and I can't get it, that it was actually thinking, I think in the article, I used the sort of the ripple effects of it. That was surprising to me, the way in which it so caught people up. And that in some ways, almost like the Depression, right? You dealt with it at hand, and then you wanted to move past it as quickly as possible. And so to me, it's a lost opportunity. And when you also think that this is the same moment when the first Earth Day is taking place, there was an opportunity to, forgive the automotive metaphor, to change gears and to potentially think about a different way forward. And that, I think it was the two things that surprised me were that it was felt so profoundly and that then nothing happened. Maybe it's not that nothing happened. Maybe it was that the lessons learned had to kind of go back and gestate for a little longer. And that change is incremental. We can think about this in terms of racial justice too, right? We know it doesn't happen all at once, right? Change is incremental. And not that we're ever going to get to some moment of, I mean, I don't want to sound casual. It's like, we will never arrive at a post-racial moment. We will never arrive at a post-auto moment. The question is, can we figure out a way forward in which the car has its place? Because the car does have its place. To your earlier point about people simply not having access to other forms of transportation, we can fix that. That we know how to fix. Express buses, the kinds of things that many cities are doing now, like making new connections that make sense. I mean, in New York, it's been probably at least, 15 years now that or maybe with MetroCard it started, that you could get a free transfer from the subway to the bus. That was a game changer, right? For a lot of people. So those kinds of things, I think we still have an opportunity. I do think that the nostalgia for some earlier moment will remain. And also, even if it is not conscious as a nostalgia for that earlier moment, there is still, that say is bound up in kind of fetishizing a certain kind of diner or what have you. I still think that there is a kind of nostalgia for living a certain way. And so you see it in the bulked up state of SUVs and such. Is it too much to say that beefed up scale of all of those vehicles is a sure sign of the waning of the United States as a global superpower, that like all that's left is your car that looks like a tank. And again, I mean, if I were actually going to write a piece about it, I could imagine writing a piece in which the withdrawal from Afghanistan is somehow compared to a super beefed up truck or SUV, almost in a kind of inverse relationship. The other thing I think is fascinating, and I don't know how we really wrap this in, but I did want to mention it, is about, because we were talking about gas stations, is if in the 70s, there were all these gas stations that were all these independent gas stations that went out of business because the big oil companies like basically shut off the siphon and, didn't allow them to stay in business. There's a phenomenon that is happening, I'm sure it's happening in San Francisco, of the disappearing gas station, in which the big oil companies who were still running these retail outlets, they realized that the gas station was worth more as real estate than as a gas station. And so, at least in Manhattan and in the kind of closer in parts of Brooklyn, gas stations they're disappearing. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. And of course, it has nothing to do with our notion of there being fewer cars in cities, and everything to do with unfettered capitalism just doing the thing that it always does, which is, I don't care if this gas station actually serves a use, or it's more valuable for me to sell it to this person who's going to put luxury housing on it. One could argue, oh, fewer gas stations, isn't that good? Aren't they like nasty brownfields that we don't want around? Like, well, yes, but is this the solution? We still actually need them because people do still have to fill up their cars. I don't have any kind of like profound conclusion about it, but I just think it's a fascinating phenomenon that demonstrates the complexity of all of this. And it's to your earlier point, if we take the streets and we say, well, what should they be used for? Should they be for commercial purposes or should they be for something else? This is the same issue. Like, okay, if we're going to dismantle the broad infrastructure of the car, what replaces it? We think about all the places where they took down highways in San Francisco, in Boston, where they took down elevated highways. And then like the thing about the big dig in Boston, and, it was ending up stitching the city back together. And I think there are examples of those kinds of projects where there has been a real thought about the public realm. But what happens in dispersed places, in largely suburban places? How do they knit themselves back together when it was the idea of dispersal that was part of their kind of urban DNA? This comes back to where I began with a sort of the necessity of thinking regionally or in the metropolitan way, because there tends to be a kind of urban myopia that we're so focused on the traditional city, the conventional city, that we forget about the larger issues that, well, now in many cases, less wealthy places, what we now refer to as inner ring suburbs, who are suffering, right? They're really suffering. They don't have the resources of the richer ex-urban suburbs to sort of make these changes, even if they wanted to.
Where can folks find you if they want more information about your book or the article, or are you on Twitter? Is there a place where people can find you?
Well, I have a website, esperdy.net. And I've got stuff there. And then, I'm not on Twitter. I am, but I don't really do it. But I am on Instagram, Gabachan NYC, I think. You can just Google me. My stuff's around. Places is one. Let's send everything to Places. Places needs more, can always use more traffic. I love Places. I love Nancy. I share her commitment to scholarship in the public realm. Some of my best work is on Places. So that's, I think, a great place for people to start.
Yeah, Places Journal is a great, whenever I post a Places Journal article into my newsletter, they always get a very popular reception. I think people put it up there with, journalistic efforts, the top in the country. And I think that's a very high praise for them because they put together such a great product. It's just a great informational place to go to get what you need. Mm-hmm. Well, Gabrielle, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm delighted that we had a chance to have this conversation, and really thought-provoking. And it's always nice to meet another Star Wars person.